Chihawi Mountain Fury. Mama Dawn butchered. 19 deputies who chained her 12-year-old son in a basement. The bloodiest act of vengeance against local authority in North Carolina history, and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Blue Ridge Mountains had ever witnessed from a mother defending her child. This is the true story of Mama Dawn. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Madison County, North Carolina, in the shadow of Chihawi Mountain, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The Blue Ridge rises here in ancient folds of stone and forest, peaks and hollows that have sheltered families for generations, terrain that seems designed to hide those who wish to remain hidden from the world beyond. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through decades of conflict with authorities who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Madison County in 1923, the bonds between mother and child were sacred beyond any law written by distant legislators or enforced by local deputies. The mountain people had developed over generations a code that governed their interactions, a system of understood rules that placed the protection of children above all other obligations. A mother's duty to defend her offspring was absolute, recognized by everyone who lived in these hollows, understood to supersede any competing claim that government or society might make. This code existed outside the official legal system, and in many ways was more effective at maintaining order than anything the county sheriff could impose. The conflict between local law enforcement and the mountain communities had been simmering for decades by the time our story begins. Prohibition had given sheriffs new powers and new reasons to intrude into the lives of families who had been making whiskey for generations, who viewed the trade not as crime but as tradition, not as law-breaking but as survival. The deputies who enforced these laws often came from lowland towns, men who viewed the highland people with contempt and who saw in their poverty an excuse for cruelty. The enforcement they brought was heavy-handed, designed to demonstrate dominance rather than to achieve justice. The woman who would become known throughout North Carolina simply as Mama Dawn was born Donna Mae Shelton in 1885, in a cabin on the banks of Spring Creek that her grandfather had built with his own hands before the Civil War. She was the fourth of 8 children, born into a family that had worked this land since the first settlers arrived, that had fought in every American war, that had buried 4 generations in the small cemetery on the ridge above the home place. The fierce protectiveness that defined her character was evident from childhood, a willingness to defend those she loved that would later prove capable of things no one could have imagined. That's right. Donna Shelton had grown up in a world where family was everything, where the bonds between mother and child were unbreakable, where the protection of the young was the highest duty any adult could fulfill. She had learned early that the world was dangerous, that children needed defenders, that a mother's role in mountain society included the fierce guardianship of those who could not protect themselves. These lessons shaped everything she would later become. Her childhood had been marked by the rhythms of farm life, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that sustained families who lived close to the land. She had learned to work from the time she could walk, had absorbed the understanding that survival required effort, that nothing was given freely, that strength came in many forms and was not limited to physical power. She developed early the iron will that mountain life required, a determination that would sustain her through tragedies that would have broken weaker spirits. Her education had been practical rather than academic, focused on the knowledge that mountain life required. She learned to read well enough to study the Bible, to do arithmetic sufficient for household management, to absorb the basic learning that the one-room schoolhouse could provide during the months when she was not needed at home. But her real education came from her mother and grandmothers, who taught her the skills of healing and nurturing, the arts of keeping a family alive through hard winters and harder times. Her marriage to a man named Elias Whitaker in 1903 had been a love match that united 2 respected families in the Spring Creek community. Elias was a farmer and occasional moonshiner, a quiet man who worked hard and asked nothing from the world except to be left in peace. Together they built a life on land that Donna's father had given them, raising crops and children with the devotion that mountain families brought to everything they did. The children came steadily through the years that followed, 6 of them in all, 4 boys and 2 girls. The Whitaker homestead became a prosperous place by mountain standards, the combined efforts of parents and children producing results that their neighbors acknowledged with respect. Elias was known throughout the community as a man who kept his word, whose work was always honest, who minded his own business, but who would not allow himself or his family to be mistreated. By 1923, Dawna Whitaker was 38 years old, known throughout Madison County as Mama Dawn, a title that acknowledged both her status as mother of 6 and her role as a woman to whom neighbors came when they needed help. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair that had not yet begun to gray and eyes that missed nothing. Nothing about her appearance suggested the capacity for violence that would later make her name infamous throughout the state. She looked like what she was, a mountain mother devoted to her family and her community. Her youngest child was a boy named Samuel, born in 1911 and 12 years old in the spring of 1923. Samuel was a bright and curious child, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet strength, a boy who helped with chores without complaint, and who showed promise of becoming the kind of man the community would respect. He was Mama Dawn's particular favorite, the baby of the family, the one who had come when she thought her childbearing years were over, the one who held a special place in her heart that the older children understood and did not resent. Now, to understand what happened in the spring of 1923, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Whitaker family targets for the county sheriff's attention. That's right. A new sheriff had been elected in Madison County, a man named Virgil Tate, who had campaigned on promises to eliminate moonshining, and who had assembled a force of deputies notable for their willingness to use violence. Tate was 42 years old, a lowland man who had no understanding of mountain ways and who viewed the highland people as criminals, to be subdued rather than citizens to be served. The Whitaker family's moonshine operation had attracted Tate's attention within weeks of his taking office. Elias ran a still in the hollow above Spring Creek, producing whiskey that was known throughout the region for its quality. The mountain people had been making whiskey for generations, viewed it as a legitimate use of their corn, saw no crime in an activity that had sustained families through hard times for longer than anyone could remember. But to Sheriff Tate, the Whitakers represented exactly the kind of defiance that he intended to crush. The raid was planned for a Thursday morning in late April, when the sheriff expected to catch Elias at the still, with evidence that would ensure conviction. What Tate did not know, and what would become central to everything that followed, was that Elias had been warned and had hidden the operation the night before. When the deputies arrived at the Whitaker homestead, they found nothing illegal, no still, no whiskey, no evidence of the crime they had come to prosecute. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of April 26, 1923, had started like any other spring day on Spring Creek. Samuel had risen early to help with morning chores, had been feeding the chickens when the sound of horses announced the arrival of the deputies. 19 men surrounded the property with weapons drawn, expecting to find moonshiners at work, finding instead only a woman and her youngest child going about their ordinary business. Sheriff Tate was furious at finding nothing, understood that his carefully planned raid had failed, that someone had warned the Whitakers, that he would return to town empty-handed. His anger needed an outlet, and he found one in the 12-year-old boy who was watching the deputies search the property with undisguised contempt. When Tate demanded to know where the still was hidden, Samuel responded with the mountain pride his mother had taught him, refusing to answer questions about his father's business. What happened next would be remembered in Madison County for generations. Sheriff Tate decided that if he could not find the still, he would use the boy to force Elias Whitaker to surrender himself and his operation. He ordered his deputies to seize Samuel, to take him to the county jail in Marshall, to hold him until his father came forward with information about the moonshining operation. Mama Dawn protested, demanded to know what charges justified taking her child, was pushed back by deputies who laughed at her attempts to reach her son. The seizure of Samuel was illegal by any standard, a kidnapping carried out under color of law, justified by no warrant, and supported by no evidence. A 12-year-old boy had committed no crime, had merely refused to inform on his father, had exercised a right that even the law recognized. But Sheriff Tate was unconcerned with legality, understood that in Madison County he could do whatever he wanted to mountain families without facing consequences from authorities who shared his contempt for the Highland people. Mama Dawn followed the deputies to Marshall, arriving at the courthouse to demand her son's release, to threaten legal action, to do everything a mother could do through legitimate channels. She was told that Samuel would be held until Elias surrendered, that the boy's release depended entirely on his father's cooperation, that she should go home and convince her husband to come forward. She demanded to see her son, was refused, was told that prisoners were not permitted visitors until the sheriff authorized it. What Mama Dawn did not know, what she would not discover until days later, was where Samuel was actually being held. The county jail in Marshall was full, and Sheriff Tate had decided to house his young prisoner elsewhere. He had taken Samuel to the basement of a building he owned on the edge of town, a structure that had once been a warehouse and that now served as storage for equipment and supplies. In this basement, Samuel was chained to a support beam, his ankle locked in an iron shackle that allowed him to move only a few feet in any direction. The conditions in that basement were horrific beyond anything a mother could imagine. The space was dark, lit only by what little light filtered through a small window near the ceiling. The floor was dirt, damp from groundwater that seeped through the foundation. Rats moved freely through the space, emboldened by darkness and the presence of food scraps that accumulated when meals were provided. The chain that held Samuel was heavy, designed for adult prisoners, leaving bruises on his ankle that would take weeks to heal. For 5 days Samuel remained in that basement, fed irregularly, given water that was often contaminated, forced to relieve himself in a bucket that was emptied only when the smell became unbearable. The deputies who checked on him daily treated him with contempt, made comments about what happened to children whose parents defied the law, suggested that his situation could become much worse if his father did not cooperate. The psychological terror they inflicted was as devastating as the physical conditions. Mama Dawn spent those 5 days in agony, moving between the courthouse and the jail, demanding information about her son, receiving only evasions and lies. She was told that Samuel was being held in the jail, that he was being treated well, that he would be released as soon as his father cooperated. She begged to see him, was refused each time, was left to imagine what was happening to her child while she was powerless to help him. The truth emerged on the 6th day, when a man who worked in the building where Samuel was held came to Mama Dawn with information that would change everything. He had heard the boy crying in the basement, had investigated and found the conditions in which Samuel was being kept, had been horrified by what he discovered. He told Mama Dawn where her son was, described the chains and the darkness and the rats, gave her the knowledge she needed to act. What happened next would become legend in Madison County. Mama Dawn did not go to the authorities, did not file a complaint that would be ignored, did not pursue legal remedies that the system would deny. She went to the building where her son was held, carrying a shotgun that had belonged to her father, accompanied by Elias and their older sons who had been summoned from hiding. They found Samuel in the basement, chained to the beam exactly as the informant had described, his ankle bloody from the shackle, his eyes empty from 5 days of terror in the darkness. The deputy who was supposed to be guarding Samuel tried to stop them, reached for his weapon, died before he could draw it. Mama Dawn killed him without hesitation, without warning, with a blast from the shotgun that left no doubt about her determination. The family freed Samuel, carried him out of that basement into sunlight he had not seen in nearly a week, began the journey home that would be the start of something far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The aftermath of Samuel's rescue was chaos. Sheriff Tate mobilized his remaining deputies, declared the Whitaker family outlaws, announced that they had killed a law officer and would be brought to justice regardless of what it took. The mountain community closed around the Whitakers, hiding them, providing food and supplies, refusing to cooperate with investigators who came asking questions. The conflict had escalated beyond anything that could be resolved through normal channels. But Mama Dawn was not interested in hiding, was not content to wait for the authorities to forget what had happened. She had seen what they had done to Samuel, had seen the bloody ankle and the empty eyes and the flinch when anyone approached him too quickly. She had held her 12-year-old son while he woke screaming from nightmares about rats in the darkness, had watched him jump at every unexpected sound, had understood that something precious had been broken that might never fully heal. She would kill them. Every deputy who had participated in her son's kidnapping and imprisonment, every man who had known about the basement and had done nothing, every person responsible for the 5 days of horror that Samuel had endured. 19 deputies had come to her property that morning. 19 deputies would die before she was finished. And that vow, made in the silence of a house haunted by her son's screams, would be fulfilled beyond anything Mama Dawn herself could have imagined. The planning process took 3 months, during which the Whitaker family remained hidden in the mountains, while Mama Dawn gathered the intelligence she would need. The deputy she had killed during Samuel's rescue was the first of her victims, though at the time she had not yet conceived the full scope of what she would do. The remaining 18 would die one by one over the months that followed, hunted with a patience and determination that would become legendary. She learned the identities of every deputy who had participated in the raid, their names obtained through the mountain grapevine that carried news the authorities never saw. She studied their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She identified where each man lived, when each traveled alone, when each would be most vulnerable to the kind of attack she was planning. The network of information that mountain women maintained became her source of intelligence for planning murder. The weapons she would use were those the family had always owned, rifles and pistols that served equally for hunting game and for defending what was theirs. She was already an excellent shot, had been hunting since childhood, had the patience and skill that mountain life developed in those who survived it. The transition from hunting animals to hunting men required adjustments, but the fundamental skills were the same. Her first deliberate kill came in August 1923, 3 months after Samuel's rescue. The target was a deputy named Thomas Blackburn, who had been among those who had seized Samuel, who had been seen dragging the boy toward the horses while Mama Dawn screamed for them to stop. Blackburn was found shot dead on a road outside Marshall, killed by a single rifle shot from a distance that demonstrated remarkable marksmanship. No witnesses, no evidence, no suspect identified by the official investigation. The killing of Thomas Blackburn was attributed to the general violence that characterized the region during Prohibition, assumed to be the result of some moonshine dispute unrelated to the Whitaker case. No one connected the death to the mother whose son had been chained in a basement, whose rescue of that son had already claimed one deputy's life. No one imagined that Mama Dawn was capable of such calculated violence, that her campaign had only just begun. The second killing came 3 weeks later, targeting another deputy who had participated in the raid. This man, named Robert Caldwell, was found shot dead in his home outside Hot Springs, killed through a window while he sat by his fire. The method was similar to the first killing, the marksmanship equally impressive, the victim equally connected to the events of April 26th. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in September 1923, demonstrating that Mama Dawn's campaign was accelerating. The victims were both deputies from the Tate Force, both killed with the precision that had characterized the earlier deaths. The sheriff's department began to realize that something unusual was happening, that their members were being targeted by someone with knowledge of their identities and movements. That's right. Mama Dawn continued her campaign through the fall and winter of 1923-1924, striking with a regularity that kept her enemies constantly off balance. The fifth deputy died in October, found floating in the French Broad River with a bullet wound in his back. He had been fishing alone, confident that he was safe in a spot miles from any Whitaker property. Mama Dawn had tracked him for weeks, had learned his habits, had waited for the perfect moment when no witnesses would be present. The sixth was ambushed on a mountain road in November, shot from a ridge above while he traveled between towns. The single shot struck him in the chest, killing him before he could understand what had happened. His horse was found wandering, saddlebags still attached, no sign of robbery to explain his death. He had been one of those who had checked on Samuel daily, who had mocked the boy's tears and threatened worse treatment if his father did not surrender. The seventh and eighth died on the same night in December, killed in a coordinated attack that demonstrated capabilities no one had suspected the killer possessed. Both men had been involved in guarding Samuel during his imprisonment, had been among those who had mocked him and threatened him with worse treatment. Mama Dawn had recruited help for this double killing, family members who shared her grief and who were willing to take risks to achieve justice. The timing sent a message that everyone understood. The killer remembered exactly who had done what. The winter months brought no respite for the remaining deputies. They huddled in their homes, afraid to venture out alone, jumping at every sound in the night. Some tried to maintain the appearance of normal duties, patrolling in pairs or groups, but even this provided little comfort when their colleagues continued to die. The killer seemed to know everything about them, their routines and their hiding places, their strengths and their vulnerabilities. The terror that spread through the remaining deputies was profound and paralyzing. These were men who had considered themselves powerful, who had used their badges to intimidate and brutalize without consequence. Now they were the ones being hunted, the ones who could not sleep for fear of what the night might bring, the ones who saw threats in every shadow. Some began drinking heavily, trying to drown the fear that consumed them. Others became paranoid, suspecting everyone around them, trusting no one. Sheriff Tate tried to maintain control, tried to project confidence that the killer would be caught, but his authority was crumbling with each new death. Deputies refused assignments that took them into the mountains alone. Patrols that had once been routine became exercises in terror, every sound potentially the last thing they would hear. The department that had chained Samuel Whitaker in a basement was discovering that such cruelty had consequences they had never imagined. The community watched with a mixture of fear and satisfaction as the deputies fell one by one. No one spoke openly about supporting the killings, but no one cooperated with investigators either. The wall of silence that protected Mama Dawn was absolute, a collective judgment that what was happening was justice rather than murder, that the men who died had earned their fate through their treatment of a child. Each killing was executed with care that reflected Mama Dawn's intimate knowledge of the mountains. She knew every path and hollow, every ridge and creek, every hiding place that Chihawi Mountain and its surrounding peaks contained. She knew how to move through the forest without leaving traces, how to approach her targets without being seen, how to disappear after striking without anyone being able to follow. The skills of survival that every mountain woman possessed had been adapted to a deadlier purpose. The investigation into the killings eventually recognized the pattern that connected them. A state investigator was assigned to the case, and he quickly identified the common factor. All the victims had participated in the raid on the Whitaker property and the subsequent imprisonment of Samuel. The investigator began to suspect that someone was seeking revenge, though he found it difficult to imagine who might be responsible for such sustained violence against armed lawmen. The surveillance of the Whitaker family intensified, with investigators watching the movements of Elias and the older sons, assuming that one of them must be the killer. Mama Dawn was largely ignored in this surveillance, her gender placing her beyond suspicion in the minds of men who could not imagine a woman capable of such calculated violence. The investigators watched her husband and sons, while she continued her campaign unimpeded. The 9th killing came on the first anniversary of Samuel's rescue, April 26, 1924. Mama Dawn had saved this date for a special target, the deputy who had been responsible for the daily checks on Samuel, who had been the one to mock the boy and threaten him with worse treatment. This man, named William Foster, had taken particular pleasure in Samuel's suffering, had described in detail what would happen if the family did not cooperate. Mama Dawn found him on the anniversary and ensured that his death was neither quick nor painless. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each targeting deputies identified as active participants in Samuel's imprisonment. The 12th came in June, the 13th in July, the 14th in August. By the summer of 1924, 14 of the 19 deputies were dead, including the one killed during the rescue, and the remaining 5 had fled Madison County entirely, seeking safety in other states where they hoped the Mountain Avenger could not find them. But Mama Dawn found them anyway, tracking them through networks of information that extended far beyond the county of her birth. The mountain people had relatives and connections throughout the region, and these networks carried news of where the fleeing deputies had gone. The 15th deputy died in Tennessee, shot through his boarding house window. The 16th was killed in Virginia, ambushed on a road outside the town where he had sought refuge. The 17th died in South Carolina, his body discovered in a field behind the farm where he had been hiding. The 18th killing came in the fall of 1924, leaving only Sheriff Tate himself. The man who had ordered Samuel's seizure and imprisonment, who had chosen to chain a 12-year-old boy in a rat-infested basement to pressure his father, who had set in motion everything that followed. Tate had barricaded himself in his home in Marshall, surrounded by the few men still willing to associate with him, convinced that he was safe behind walls and guards. He was wrong about that safety. The 19th and final killing came on November 15, 1924, 18 months after Samuel's imprisonment. Mama Dawn reached Tate despite every precaution, found a way past defenses that would have stopped anyone less determined. She entered his home in the early hours of a November morning, bypassed guards who had grown complacent after months of vigilance, reached the bedroom where Tate slept with multiple weapons within reach. What passed between them in those final moments was never recorded, known only to Mama Dawn and to the man she killed. But when Tate's body was found the next morning, the evidence suggested that his death had not been quick. He had been found chained to a support beam in his own basement, the same method he had used on Samuel. He had been left in the darkness for hours, had experienced something of what a 12-year-old boy had experienced. The final bullet had come only after he understood, truly understood, what he had done. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Mama Dawn was arrested 2 weeks after Tate's death, identified by evidence found at the scene and by the pattern that connected all 19 killings to her son's imprisonment. The case against her was built on circumstantial evidence, on witness testimony, on the obvious motive that Samuel's treatment provided. She did not deny what she had done, seemed almost proud of it, faced her accusers with a dignity that commanded respect, even from those who condemned her actions. The trial of Dawna, Mama Dawn Whitaker, became the most sensational criminal proceeding in North Carolina history, drawing national attention and spectators who traveled from across the country to witness the case. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to follow updates from those fortunate enough to secure seats inside. Newspapers sent reporters from distant cities, making Mama Dawn's story known to millions who had never heard of Madison County or Chihowie Mountain. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its contrasts. The defendant was a mountain woman of 39 years, her dark hair now showing traces of gray, her face weathered by hard work and harder grief. She sat quietly through testimony that described her killings in graphic detail, showed no reaction when witnesses identified her as the woman they had seen near crime scenes, maintained a composure that some found chilling and others found admirable. Her hands folded in her lap showed the calluses of a lifetime of mountain work. The spectators included journalists from across the nation, curious observers who had traveled hundreds of miles, and supporters from the mountain community who packed the galleries whenever space permitted. The latter group was notable for its size and its composition, mothers who understood viscerally what Mama Dawn had experienced, who knew in their hearts what they would have done in her place. Their silent presence was a statement that required no words. Samuel was present in the courtroom, now 13 years old, sitting with his father and siblings in the front row behind the defense table. The scars on his ankle where the shackle had rubbed were no longer visible, but other scars remained, evident in the way he startled at sudden movements, in the shadows that passed across his face when testimony described the basement where he had been held. His presence was a constant reminder of what had started everything. The prosecution presented its case methodically, connecting Mama Dawn to the deaths through evidence that demonstrated planning and determination. They called forensic experts who analyzed bullet trajectories and matched weapons to wounds, who built a technical case that was impressive in its detail. The prosecutor, a state attorney named Charles Morrison, understood the difficulty of his position but pressed forward with professional determination. They portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered 19 men, most of them officers of the law, who had shown no mercy regardless of any circumstances. Morrison argued that the law must apply equally to everyone, that vigilante justice could not be tolerated regardless of the provocation, that Mama Dawn's actions threatened the fabric of civilized society. He demanded the death penalty, arguing that the scope and premeditation of her crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. But the trial became something more than a murder prosecution. The defense, led by a lawyer named William Mitchell, who had volunteered to take the case without fee, used the proceedings to put Sheriff Tate and his department on trial. He called witnesses who testified to the circumstances of Samuel's seizure, to the basement where he had been chained, to the conditions he had endured for 5 days, while his mother was denied any knowledge of where he was. The testimony about Samuel's imprisonment shocked the courtroom and the nation. Witnesses described the basement, the darkness, the rats that moved freely through the space. They described the chain that had held a 12-year-old boy to a support beam, the shackle that had left his ankle bloody, the bucket that served for sanitation. They described the terror that the deputies had inflicted, the threats and mockery, the deliberate cruelty that had no purpose except to break a child's spirit. The man who had discovered Samuel and reported his location to Mama Dawn testified about what he had found. His voice broke as he described hearing a child crying in the darkness, investigating and finding a boy chained like an animal, in conditions that would have been unacceptable for livestock. He described Samuel's physical state, the weight he had lost, the injuries to his ankle, the haunted look in his eyes. His testimony brought tears to the eyes of spectators and jurors alike. Samuel himself was called to testify, and his appearance on the stand became the emotional climax of the trial. He described being seized by the deputies, being taken to the basement, being chained to the beam. He described the darkness and the cold and the rats that came in the night. He described the deputies who checked on him, their threats and their laughter, the way they had told him his parents had abandoned him. His voice was steady but quiet, the voice of a child who had learned not to trust the world. The photographs of the basement were entered into evidence, showing the beam where Samuel had been chained, the marks where the shackle had rubbed, the conditions that no child should ever have to endure. The courtroom gasped when the photographs were displayed, and several jurors were seen wiping tears from their eyes. The images made visceral what words could only approximate. Medical testimony described the physical and psychological effects of Samuel's imprisonment. Doctors explained the injuries to his ankle, the malnutrition from inadequate food, the signs of trauma that would likely persist for years. Psychologists described the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting adults. They painted a picture of a child who had been deliberately broken by men who wore badges and claimed to represent the law. The defense attorney's closing argument focused not on denying what Mama Dawn had done, but on explaining why she had done it. He described a mother whose 12-year-old son had been seized without warrant, held without charge, chained in a rat-infested basement, while she was told he was safe in jail. He described her discovery of the truth, her rescue of her child, her realization that the system would never hold those responsible accountable. He asked the jury to consider what any mother would do when faced with such circumstances. The jury deliberated for 6 days, the longest deliberation in North Carolina legal history, suggesting that the decision was far from straightforward. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the community's sympathy for a mother who had defended her child. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 19 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a repudiation of the system that had chained Samuel Whitaker in a basement and had protected those responsible. It acknowledged that while Mama Dawn had committed terrible acts, the acts committed against her son were equally terrible and had received no official censure. The judge, a man named Robert Patterson, who had listened to testimony with evident emotion, sentenced Mama Dawn to 19 concurrent terms of 3 years each, with eligibility for parole after 2 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow. Mama Dawn served 26 months at the North Carolina Correctional Center for Women before being released on parole in early 1927. She was 42 years old, had spent more than 2 years in prison for seeking the justice that the legal system had denied her son. She returned to Madison County, to the mountains she had never wanted to leave, to Samuel and the rest of her family who had waited for her throughout her imprisonment. The years following her release were quiet ones, marked by the rhythms of farm life that had always defined her existence. She lived in the cabin on Spring Creek with Elias, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren who visited regularly. The community accepted her back without judgment, understood that what she had done, however terrible, had grown from a love and an injustice that demanded response. Samuel slowly recovered from the worst of his trauma, helped by his mother's return and by the knowledge that those who had chained him in darkness had been punished. He never fully lost the wariness that the basement had created, never completely stopped checking shadows and listening for threats. But he was able to build something like a normal life, to marry and have children of his own, to become the kind of man the community respected. He named his first daughter Donna, after the mother who had loved him enough to become something terrible in his defense. Mama Dawn never spoke publicly about her campaign, never granted interviews to the journalists who sought her out, never confirmed or denied the details that had emerged during her trial. The silence she maintained was complete, a refusal to revisit events that had consumed years of her life. When asked about those years, she would simply say that she had done what any mother would do, that the matter was closed. Her visits to Samuel's home continued throughout her remaining years, a constant presence in the lives of her grandchildren, who knew the story of what their grandmother had done. She told them about the mountains and the old ways, about the importance of family and the duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. She did not tell them about the killings, left that for others to share when the children were old enough to understand. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1962 at the age of 77. She had outlived everyone directly involved in Samuel's imprisonment, had seen the end of Prohibition and 2 world wars, had watched her grandchildren grow into adults with families of their own. She was buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the home place, the stone that marked her grave bearing only her name and dates, no epitaph to summarize a life that defied simple summary. The aftermath of Mama Dawn's campaign reshaped law enforcement practices in the North Carolina mountains for a generation. The exposure of what had been done to Samuel, which came out in devastating detail during the trial, generated public outrage that could not be ignored. Newspapers that had previously ignored or dismissed the concerns of mountain communities now published editorials demanding reform. Politicians who had supported men like Tate found themselves facing questions they could not answer. Congressional representatives from North Carolina were forced to address the issue, receiving letters from constituents who demanded action. State legislators convened hearings that examined law enforcement practices across the mountain counties, hearing testimony that shocked even those who had suspected problems existed. The accumulated evidence created a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. Investigations were launched into sheriff's departments throughout the region, revealing patterns of abuse that extended far beyond Madison County. Other families came forward with stories of similar treatment, of children used as leverage against their parents, of illegal imprisonments in unofficial locations, of conditions that violated every principle of civilized treatment. The Whitaker case was the most dramatic, but it was far from the only example of such abuse. The reforms that followed were significant, though they came too late for Samuel and for the many other children who had suffered at the hands of brutal deputies. Procedures were established prohibiting the detention of minors without proper authorization, requiring that prisoners be held in official facilities, mandating humane treatment of all those in custody. The use of imprisonment as leverage against family members was explicitly prohibited, and mechanisms were created for investigating complaints about deputy conduct. Training programs were developed that emphasized the rights of citizens, even those accused of crimes, and the limits that officers must observe regardless of their personal feelings or their desire to solve cases. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened, making it harder for sheriffs to operate without accountability. The casual brutality that had characterized Tate's department was officially condemned, though it would take years before such practices were truly eliminated. The political consequences extended beyond law enforcement policy. The trial had exposed the corruption that allowed men like Tate to hold power, the political machines that protected them from accountability, the failures of oversight that permitted abuse to flourish. Reformers used the Mama Dawn case as evidence of what needed to change, and change slowly came to the mountain counties of North Carolina. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Mama Dawn case became a symbol throughout the region of what could happen when law enforcement forgot that children were sacred, when those charged with protecting the innocent instead preyed upon them. Parents told their children the story as a warning about the abuse of power, as a reminder that authority could be corrupted, as an example of what mothers were capable of when their children were threatened. The gravesite where Mama Dawn rests became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered the story, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a mother who had refused to accept the imprisonment of her child without response. The stone that marks her resting place is simple, weathered by decades of mountain weather, but the name carved into it remains legible. Flowers appear there regularly, left by visitors who have heard the story and want to acknowledge it. The songs that emerged from the Mama Dawn story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the raid through the imprisonment, through the campaign to the trial. These songs celebrated her determination, described her killings in detail that bordered on admiration, portrayed her as a symbol of maternal love pushed beyond all limits by an injustice too great to bear. One popular ballad described the basement where Samuel was held, painting a vivid picture of a 12-year-old boy chained in darkness while rats moved around him. The song captured the horror of those 5 days, the terror that the deputies inflicted, the mother who searched desperately for her child while being told he was safe. It portrayed Mama Dawn's discovery of the truth, her rescue of Samuel, her transformation from desperate mother to avenging fury. The verses describing the basement became iconic, repeated in countless retellings. They captured the chain around a child's ankle, the darkness that swallowed all hope, the sounds of rats in the night. They described Samuel's prayers for rescue, his certainty that his mother would come, his gradual despair as the days passed without salvation. The image became a symbol of what happened when power was exercised without conscience or restraint. Another song told the story from the perspective of the deputies, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood that death was hunting them, that nothing could protect them from the consequences of what they had done to a child. It described sleepless nights spent watching windows, every sound a potential warning, every stranger a potential killer. The song imagined their desperate attempts to flee, their belief that distance would provide safety, their dawning realization that Mama Dawn would track them wherever they went. It portrayed the final moments of each deputy, the understanding that the mother whose child they had chained in a basement had become the most dangerous person they would ever encounter. The moral was unmistakable. Those who harm children may escape consequences for a time, but eventually the debt comes due. A third song focused on the relationship between mother and son, describing the love that had bound them and that had driven everything that followed. This song was more tender than the others, avoiding the violence of the ballads in favor of a meditation on maternal love and the lengths to which it will go when a child is threatened. It described Samuel naming his daughter Dawna, the tears that Mama Dawn shed when she held her granddaughter for the first time, the healing that came slowly but eventually came. A fourth song addressed Sheriff Tate directly, condemning the man who had ordered a child chained in a basement and paid with his life. The verses described his arrogance, his contempt for the mountain people, his certainty that he could do whatever he wanted to their children without consequence. They portrayed his attempts to hide after his deputies began dying, his barricades and guards, his final understanding that the mother whose son he had imprisoned would find him regardless. The most famous of all the Mama Dawn songs was composed several decades later by a professional musician who traveled to Madison County to research the story. This comprehensive ballad told the complete narrative with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in the Appalachian music repertoire. It has been recorded by numerous artists over the years, carrying Mama Dawn's story to audiences who never knew her name but who recognized in her actions something universal about love and protection and justice. Historians who have studied the Mama Dawn case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corrupt authority during Prohibition, arguing that the sheriff's conduct during the imprisonment justified whatever response it provoked. They note that the legal system had provided no remedy for Samuel's treatment, that the official channels that should have protected a child instead victimized him, that Mama Dawn's campaign was the only form of accountability those responsible would ever face. These scholars have traced the roots of the conflict to the broader tensions of the Prohibition era, when federal and local authorities sought to impose urban values on rural communities that had their own traditions and their own understanding of right and wrong. The mountain people had been making whiskey for generations, saw no crime in an activity that harmed no one, resented the intrusion of authorities who treated them as criminals for continuing practices their grandfathers had followed. The economic analysis reveals why moonshining remained so important to mountain families despite the risks. The Depression was approaching, money was scarce, and whiskey represented one of the few reliable sources of cash income for families who grew their own food but needed currency for taxes and goods they could not produce themselves. Sheriff Tate's campaign against moonshiners was not merely law enforcement, but an assault on the economic survival of entire communities. Others have focused on the targeting of children as leverage against their parents, a practice that the Mama Dawn case exposed and condemned. The use of Samuel's imprisonment to pressure Elias Whitaker into surrendering himself was recognized even at the time as crossing a line that should never be crossed. The trial testimony about the conditions in the basement shocked the nation, generated outrage that extended far beyond the mountain communities, contributed to reforms that protected children from similar treatment. Feminist scholars have examined Mama Dawn's story as evidence of women's capacity for agency, even in patriarchal societies that denied them formal power. Denied access to courts and political processes, excluded from the official channels through which grievances might be addressed, she created her own form of justice through means that were available to her. Her campaign was not an abandonment of maternal values, but an expression of them, the protective mother extended to encompass the violent defense of her child. The psychological analysis of Mama Dawn's campaign has attracted scholarly attention. Researchers have examined how she was able to sustain her determination over 18 months of hunting, how she managed the psychological burden of killing 19 men while maintaining the appearance of normal life and caring for a traumatized child. The compartmentalization required was extraordinary, suggesting either remarkable psychological resilience or a transformation so complete that the woman who killed was fundamentally different from the woman who held her son while he woke screaming from nightmares. Still others have examined the case as an example of how vigilante justice can emerge when official systems fail to protect the most vulnerable. Samuel's imprisonment was known to authorities, was sanctioned by the sheriff himself, was never investigated or punished by any official body. When the system designed to protect children instead tortured them, when those charged with enforcing the law instead violated every principle the law was supposed to embody, what options remained for those who loved the victims? Legal scholars have analyzed the jury's verdict as an example of jury nullification, the practice by which juries reject the strict application of law in favor of what they perceive as justice. The evidence against Mama Dawn was overwhelming, the killings clearly premeditated, the legal definition of murder clearly satisfied. Yet the jury chose to convict on manslaughter rather than murder, and recommended the minimum sentence. This verdict represented a community judgment that Mama Dawn's actions, however illegal, were morally justified by the circumstances. You see, what Mama Dawn did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 19 men, most of them shot without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that her victims had participated in her son's imprisonment does not eliminate the fact that she acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not hers to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing, regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. She was a mother whose 12-year-old son had been chained in a rat-infested basement for 5 days while she was told he was safe in jail, whose attempts to see him had been refused, who had discovered the truth only through the courage of a stranger who could not stay silent. The system that should have protected Samuel had instead tortured him. The system that should have punished those responsible had instead protected them. What options did she have? What would any mother do? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The imprisonment of Samuel Whitaker was legal, in the sense that the sheriff ordered it, that no one questioned his authority, that the official system treated the matter as a legitimate law enforcement action. But the imprisonment was not just. Samuel was a 12-year-old boy whose only offense had been refusing to inform on his father. His treatment was not law enforcement, but torture, not justice, but revenge for defiance. The specific circumstances that produced the Mama Dawn story, the combination of prohibition enforcement, corrupt local politics, and complete absence of protection for children, have largely changed since 1923. But the underlying questions her story raises about the limits of government power, about accountability when authorities abuse children, about what citizens can do when the system fails to protect the most vulnerable, remain as relevant today as they were a century ago. The descendants of Mama Dawn still live in those North Carolina mountains, carrying the memory of their ancestor through the generations. Family reunions include visits to the cemetery where she rests, moments of reflection on a life that encompassed both terrible suffering and terrible vengeance. The story is told to each new generation, ensuring that what happened will not be forgotten even as those who lived it pass away. The mountains of Madison County remain today much as they were in Mama Dawn's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where the Whitaker homestead once stood still shelters descendants of families who witnessed what happened, who saw Samuel seized, who later learned what his mother had done to avenge him. The cabin where Mama Dawn lived and raised her children has long since fallen to ruin, but the land remains in the family, worked by great-grandchildren who know the history and honor the memory. The community that surrounds the old Whitaker property has changed in many ways since 1923, connected now to the broader world through roads and communications that were impossible in Mama Dawn's time. Young people leave for cities, seeking opportunities that the mountains cannot provide, and the population of the county has declined with each passing decade. The moonshining culture that once defined the region has largely faded, replaced by legal employment and tourism. But the memory of what happened persists, kept alive by family members who continue to tell the story, who bring their children and grandchildren to visit the cemetery, who ensure that each new generation understands what Mama Dawn did and why she did it. The story has become a kind of inheritance, passed down like the family Bible or the deeds to the land. The cemetery where Mama Dawn rests sits on a hillside overlooking the hollow, surrounded by trees that have grown tall in the decades since her burial. The stones are weathered by nearly a century of mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain legible. Her stone is simple, marked only with her name and the years of her life. Nearby stands a stone for Elias, who outlived her by only a few years, the couple reunited in death. On the anniversary of Samuel's rescue, April 26th, family members sometimes gather at the cemetery to remember what happened. They share stories about Mama Dawn, keeping her memory alive through the telling. They share stories about Samuel, who lived into his 80s and who never forgot what his mother had done for him. They stand in silence for a moment, acknowledging the tragedy and the response that shaped everything that followed. The story of Mama Dawn endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love and what love becomes when it is forced to witness the torture of what it cherishes most. It is the story of protection and the lengths to which parents will go when those charged with enforcing the law instead violate every principle the law should embody. It is the story of justice and what justice means when official channels offer no remedy for official crimes. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Mama Dawn stood, to see the cemetery where she rests, to walk the hollow where her son was seized and imagine the basement where he was chained? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Asheville takes several hours, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The pavement gives way to gravel in places, and the gravel gives way to dirt roads that require careful navigation. The isolation that once protected the mountain people from outside interference now makes their communities difficult to reach for those who wish to understand their history. But the difficulty of the journey is part of its meaning. A reminder that the people who lived here chose this land precisely because it was hard to reach. The community welcomes visitors who come with respect, who want to learn rather than judge, who understand that they are entering a place with deep history and strong traditions. The people who live here are proud of their heritage, proud of the ancestors who refused to accept the torture of their children, proud of the mother who demonstrated that mountain women would protect their own, regardless of the cost. They will share their stories if asked politely, will point the way to the cemetery, will help visitors understand the context that makes Mama Dawn's story comprehensible. Standing at her grave, looking out over the mountains that she knew so well, one can almost feel her presence lingering in the wind that rustles through the trees. She is gone, of course, has been gone for decades now, but what she did remains, preserved in memory and in song and in the lessons that her story teaches. The questions she forces us to ask about love and protection and the limits of what any mother should be expected to endure have no easy answers, which is perhaps why her story continues to resonate so deeply with all who hear it. The mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Mama Dawn and Samuel close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Madison County during those terrible years. As long as mothers love their children with a ferocity that defies law and logic, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. She is gone now, dust mingling with the earth beside the ancestors who came before her. But what she did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The lessons of her story remain relevant even today. The tension between authority and the protection of children has not disappeared. And the question of what citizens can do when official systems fail the most vulnerable remains as urgent as ever. Mama Dawn's answer, the taking of lives in response to the torture of her son, cannot be endorsed as a model for others to follow. But her story reminds us why such answers become possible, why the social contract can break down so completely that violence seems like the only remaining option. The reforms that followed her campaign have shaped child protection for nearly a century now. The recognition that children must never be used as leverage against their parents, that minors must be held in appropriate facilities with proper oversight, that certain lines must never be crossed, regardless of law enforcement objectives. These principles were strengthened by the exposure of what had been done to Samuel Whitaker and by the terrible consequences that followed. The descendants who carry her memory understand both the horror and the necessity of what she did. They do not celebrate violence, do not wish that circumstances had required their ancestor to become a killer. But they understand that she faced a choice that no mother should ever have to face, and they honor the love that drove her to make the choice she made. Her story has become part of their identity, a reminder of what their family is capable of when protecting its own. And that, my friend, is the true story of Mama Dawn, who butchered 19 deputies after they chained her 12-year-old son Samuel in a rat-infested basement for 5 days while lying to her about his whereabouts in Madison County, North Carolina in 1923. A story of maternal love and devastating violence, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law could not and would not ever provide it. A story that reminds us of the sacred bond between mothers and children, of the fierce protectiveness that parents feel for their offspring, of the terrible consequences that follow when that bond is violated by those who should know better. The mountains remember her name and her deeds and her ultimate sacrifice made in the name of love, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across these ancient Appalachian lands, so do we all, now and forever, as long as memory endures and people gather to hear tales of mountain justice and family honor and the lengths to which love will go when forced to witness the suffering of innocence.